production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by
DHG is a full-service accounting firm serving Memphis and the Mid-South region for more than 60 years, combining community involvement with the technical resources of a national firm. For more information, visit dhgllp.com.
the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
The massive expansion of the Wolf River Greenway, tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined tonight by Chuck Flink, a project coordinator, or I should say, or a consultant on the project, and Bob Winter, who's the Greenway coordinator for the Wolf River Conservancy. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Also, Bill Dries, senior reporter with the Memphis Daily News. So we'll talk about the project in as much detail as we can, but let's start with why, and maybe I'll go with you. Why did the Wolf River Conservancy deem this, a greenway, as such an important project, a $40 million, I think, project ultimately? Why was it important?
Well, you know, it goes back to the founding of the organization 30 years ago in 1985, when the founders said, you know what, we want to see better uses of the Wolf River Basin, is what they called it in the documents, and that included sort of protecting the river, but also looking ways to connect people to the river through, and it specifically talks about constructing trails for cycling and pedestrians. So it really goes back to our beginnings. And
you're a consultant based elsewhere, but have worked on projects like this around the country. Right. Talk about this one in the context of other projects you've worked on. I mean, its scale or its ambition and so on.
Well, the American Greenway movement has been in full force now for about 30 years. And we've seen the movement grow from being sort of small, local projects, almost neighborhood scale, to now regional projects like this. And I put this on that regional scale, and we just finished a project out in Arkansas which connected 6 cities together, a 36-mile greenway. We're seeing more of these large-scale projects, and I think it addresses a couple things. 1, active transportation, 2, health and fitness, and 3, economic development. So these projects are sort of catalytic in that nature. They represent investment in return, and in the particular case of this project, where we have so much private sector investment coming in, it's a chance for the private sector to play a role in community development.
And let's talk about just some of the basics, and then I'll get Bill in here, but of the plan. There's a greenway now, and there's a green line now, which to some degree, you know, is very popular among Memphis residents. But the greenway as it is now, and then let's talk about how long it will be and how long it will take and so on to get the full greenway completed.
Sure. You want to? I'll address it. I think that one of the big differences is that, to me, the simple way of thinking it, the green line was developed on an abandoned rail track, whereas this greenway is being developed adjacent to the Wolf River. So they're 2 different projects. They are going to intersect. This, as Bob was saying, this is a project that was envisioned many years ago. Its total length is about 36 miles. Several miles have already been built, and we're talking about an 18-mile section that is within the city of Memphis, that goes from where the Wolf meets the Mississippi River out to sections of the trail that were completed a few years ago in near Germantown, Tennessee. And it sort of arcs across the north part of Memphis through some of the northern suburbs.
All right, Bill.
And let's talk about where this goes, that the green line does not go, because the arc of this is going to be north into Fraser and Raleigh, the Raleigh areas. We'll talk about the plans for the downtown end of this a bit later on the program. But talk to me about Kennedy Park and Epping Way, I believe, are the trailheads that you're talking about, which are at a bend in the Wolf River that probably lots of people are familiar with, but which hasn't had the kind of access that's envisioned here.
Yeah, so you know, the original plan for the Greenway was to go between Interstate 240, or the Loop as we call it, and the Wolf River. And some of our consultants that came into town last October said, you know, why aren't you going through Kennedy Park? And we had always sort of planned to go through Epping Way, but then we were going to bridge across the Wolf River. and go in between that sliver. But taking the trail through Kennedy Park just makes a lot of sense. It's a 260-acre park. It's rather underutilized today. It's a great asset. It could be a hub as important as some of the other big parks in Shelby County.
And let's bring up, before the other map that will kind of show where Kennedy Park is, and even the I-240 loop, so people, we're talking about greenways, but people do orient to highways. And so we can see the Wolf River Conservancy map shows where the highway is. We can see it there on the yellow, and then the Kennedy Park is up at the tip there. Is that correct? Where
That's
the red?
right. So if they look at that map and they're looking at where the red line kind of goes the highest on the map, that's Epping, and then we're coming straight down to Kennedy Park.
Okay.
And to Bill's point, Kennedy is an underutilized park. Epping is an assemblage that the Conservancy has put together. They're two really spectacular pieces of land, and I think that by having this route and alignment, we're creating an activity center near the Raleigh neighborhoods, near the North Memphis neighborhoods, that traditionally have been a little underserved in the area of park and recreation. And they're beautiful pieces of land. I think people are going to love the trails when they're open there.
How much development is going to be involved in this transformation? Kennedy Park, I think, is over
260 acres.
260 acres that we're talking about. So what kind of changes are we talking now for a park that really hasn't received a whole lot of attention in this regard for quite a while?
Right. So, Kennedy Park has got ball fields that really aren't used that much. There's soccer fields that are used pretty actively on the weekends. And then there's not really much else going on in the park. In fact, there's a boat ramp there for, if you want to paddle on the Wolf, but it's really been behind a locked gate, and so there was no access to that. So we want to reactivate these assets there, and we want to reposition that park. We've been very active out there with some volunteers, cleaning out some privet, opening up some sight lines, trying to make the park a little less of a nuisance, because there is some criminal activity going on there. So we'd like to bring the park back from that standpoint, and bringing the Greenway through both Kennedy Park and Epping Way. Epping Way's got a beautiful lake on the property. It has access to the river, as does Kennedy Park. So there's just a lot of pluses there by connecting these all together with the Wolf River Greenway Trail.
Mm-hmm.
We can create two trailheads on both properties. So that's parking lots where people can actually park. And then they can bike in between. Or as Bob's saying, we have the opportunity to do canoe access on both, so you can canoe from one to the other, canoe or kayak. So there are going to be two activity centers in that part of Memphis.
And Kennedy is an identifiable city park. What's the status of the land at Epping Way? Is that a park? Is that parkland, or is that owned by someone?
So the Conservancy now owns that land, and we've assembled some other parcels around there, so we have a little over 100 acres.
And let's talk about that. I mean, all of this, people listen and say that sounds great, and it must be, I threw it out there real quickly, the $40 million. Let's talk about the financing and the land acquisition to some extent. You all, and also when we talk about parks, people start thinking, well, wait, am I going to be paying more taxes for this, and what the city? So talk, maybe you are also, besides coordinating, your CFO of the Wolf River Conservancy. Talk about the financing, where you are in the fundraising, the city's commitment, and so on.
Okay, well, let's just start at the beginning. The Conservancy got involved with the city on this project in 2008. So this is a public-private partnership between the city of Memphis and the Wolf River Conservancy. To date, the city has invested over $4 million in the Greenway Trail project on the 3 miles that's been completed today along Humphreys Boulevard. That was on land that a trail easement was donated on, so there was no cost for land or right-of-way acquisition on that particular section of the trail. As you've mentioned, it's a $40 million project. We expect it's $40 million to complete, so not counting the $4 million plus that the city has already invested. We're looking at going forward. It's about $40 million to complete this. I have to kind of give a shout out to Director Hooks. When she entered her new role over Park Services, she came to Keith Cole and myself. Keith's the executive director of the Wolf River Conservancy, came to us and said, guys, the Greenway is really becoming very popular. The Green Line is very popular. People want to see more of this. And we're just not sure that the city is going to be able to come up with the money in a reasonable time frame. And so she challenged us. She said, you guys need to go see if you can raise half the money. And Keith and I left that meeting and we were like, the Conservancy had never done a fundraising project like that. So we went about to determine through, a process, a planning process and so forth, that, maybe we could raise half the money.
Yeah.
So that was essentially $20 million. Well, I'm pleased to report we're already past that number. So we've got commitments from foundations that exceed $22 million. Now, part of that is some match money, so we've still got some fundraising to do, but total that's about $22 million. We've got about $1.7 million in some TDOT funding that comes through the MPO process. We have a commitment from the city for $1.5 million a year for 5 years, which totals $7.5 million. And I'm sure we'll want to talk about that here in a minute. And then we've got some in-kind and individual donations that exceeds about $600,000. So all that totals about $31,500,000, and we've got about an $8.5 million gap.
And the time frame for completion, the goal is?
Yeah, so that's one of the interesting things that some of our funders said to us. They said, well, look, we want to get behind you on this project, but we're not going to wait 10 years, and so we're trying to do this in 5 years, and we've burned off about a year of that. So that's one of the reasons why we chose Alta, and in particular asked Chuck to join the project, because we knew of the success of the Razorback Trail in Northwest Arkansas. They've done it in under 5 years, and that was a Tiger grant. And
will sections of it open, I assume,
yes.
as things are completed, so it's not just it stays closed until it's all done?
No.
Yeah, and Eric, just to give you an update on that, we have 7 phases in active design right now, which we will complete those design phases by the end of this year. 2016, we're going to have those 7 phases will be in construction. The remaining, we broke the project into 16 phases. So the remaining, 9 phases, we're starting design on. That design will wrap up by mid-2016, and we'll launch into construction on the remainder of those. So you talked about a massive expansion. That's exactly what this is. This is simultaneous construction and development across the entire 18-mile corridor. And we're going to be building segments. We're picking the low-hanging fruit, and we're going to go out there and build what we can. And then over the period of the next 3 years, we'll tie it all together.
Yeah, Bill.
And this fall, I believe you said that you all are going to be doing public input sessions to let people know what's going on, hear their ideas about this as well.
Absolutely. We're going to have, in October, we're going to have back-to-back weeks where we'll have 5 public open houses across the city of Memphis. We have meetings that we're going to go to people that already meet, different types of settings where we can go to their meetings, talk about the project, and we're doing a public engagement in terms of stakeholders, just having one-on-one conversations with people. So a chance to us really to listen to the citizens of Memphis and figure out what the needs are and how to best meet the needs with this project. So.
To what degree has our experience as a community with the Green Line kind of paved the way for the Greenway? Because I can already hear some of the comments. Okay, you're going through Fraser and Raleigh, not areas that people normally associate with this. But then again, neither was the Green Line.
Right. And I was just reflecting on that with Bob on the drive over, that I've worked in a variety of different settings in urban America, and when we get into these areas that have had historic, underinvestment, what we find is pent-up demand. People do like to bike and walk. There's almost a greater need on the transportation side of the ledger here because folks can really rely on this for transportation. So we feel like the project will be very successful. We know that there's issues and concerns that people have, safety and security being one of those, and that was historic with the Green Line as well. But we feel like this project will be very successful, and it's going to be a very high-quality project, and I think people will be very proud of it.
In terms of safety and security, can you talk, is there lighting, are there cameras,
Yes.
How does all that work?
First of all, there's a couple of steps that we employ. CPTED principles, which is crime prevention through environmental design. Those are techniques that are adopted by law enforcement officials all across the United States in terms of how landscapes are designed and implemented. So that's number one. Secondly, we're going to use technology. We're employing SkyCups, video cameras, emergency phones. We're going to make sure that the landscapes, have great access in and out of different places. And then the thing to me that really makes these projects safe and secure is the amount of use they get. and the way in which this project is connected to places where people live and places that people want to go to. Very friendly for those kind of travel distances. It will make it safe and secure.
The other one, and it came up with the Green Line, and I'm sure it's come up in every community you've ever worked in on one of these things. People, property owners, homeowners who say, whoa, you're bringing all these people on my back gate or my backyard. I mean, who are these strangers? I'm nervous now. How do you address those concerns, and what's the history of these kinds of public walkways, greenways, green lines with being right up against, in some cases, people's homes and yards?
And we did this, for example, again, back in Northwest Arkansas, we had 129 separate properties that we had to negotiate with. And we talk about ways in which we can put, security fencing up or safety fencing if that's a concern, a physical connection between a property. Sometimes it's just, put up some landscaping. Sometimes there's no concern whatsoever. So, we're going to listen to the property owners that we're going to be dealing with here and figure out what their concerns are and how to best address those concerns. Sometimes safety and security is a perception issue versus an actual issue.
Right.
So we're going to deal with all of that.
And 2 quick questions, and back to Bill. You told me, I think, in another time we talked about people who sometimes resist, and then they kind of put a gate on the back of their backyard and sort of
I have built a
and
number
turn
of
it around,
projects.
and begin to access it and
we
see
put the solid
benefits.
board-on-board fence the whole way, and then people came back, and we were building 30 individual gates that locked from the inside, and people wanted access. So it's one of these things, and safety and security in America, very real thing. But a lot of it is perception based, and I mean, we obviously have real issues, but that's why we're sensitive to the needs of landowners. We're going to work with landowners.
Yeah,
definitely.
And another question, you talked about phases. What are some of the first phases that people will see completed?
So we'll be downtown on Mud Island with phase 1. The city has 3 phases that they're doing, just sort of in the Midtown area. And then we have the Epping project and Kennedy Park, and then we have a phase at the very end of the project. We call it 14B, which connects you to the existing trail at Walnut Grove. So those are the 7 phases. They are scattered across the entire length of the project, and those are the first 7 that will be built.
And if the end point, now I got one more question. If the end point is the tip of Mud Island, is that correct?
Yes.
Riverside Park there.
Confluence Park is what we want to rename.
Okay,
Right.
okay. Is that where the boat ramp is?
It
gets
is.
flooded some parts of the year. I mean, okay. And then the other end, the eastern end is
Walnut Grove.
Walnut Grove.
Right.
Okay.
For us, but not for the entire Greenway Trail project. It will be continued on all the way to the Fayette County line. So Germantown has got their Greenway. We connect with them right there by Kirby, and then of course Collierville's doing their section.
Okay. So.
And we also see the Greenway users crossing Walnut Grove currently to go to the park.
Right, but we will eventually connect with the Green Line up there close to the 240 I-40 interchange.
Right.
You see the Green Line goes underneath the interstate there. We will intersect with the Green Line in that vicinity, correct.
And Bill will also take people out to Shelby Farms, Conservancy, the big park out there. So this is a system that really winds up connecting people in a very efficient way to a lot of landscapes that people want to go to.
All right. So let's go back to downtown for a second. Confluence Park.
Right.
How does that concept work? Are you renaming the entire island, or just
No.
Let the letters come.
No, please. No, we're not going to rename all of Mud Island. Frankly, I kind of like Mud Island. I think that's a good name for it. But we were out there actually with our consultants back in October, and we broke up into teams, and we were out there, and then we'd meet back at night. And so, we're just looking at this. I got the confluence of the Wolf River with the Mississippi River, and it's this great vantage point to watch activity on the river. And we're putting the Greenway Trail in here, and there's all this open green space, and sort of nobody's ever taken it and made it their own and called it something. So we want to call the whole section from Mud Island, the whole section along North Mud Island Drive, from the river all the way to 2nd Street on the north side. We want to refer to that as Confluence Park. And there'll be the opportunity to do other things over and beyond the Wolf River Greenway Trail.
And this is where the Wolf River currently meets the Mississippi River, because before we had that drive, it met at the southern tip of Mud Island, but now it's north of that.
That's correct. Yeah, where it hits the Mississippi River today.
And Bill, the idea behind Confluence Park is it provides a north anchor, a north green space anchor to all of what's going on in the downtown, all the way down to the Harahan Bridge. So the Harahan Bridge might be the southern terminus of this Parkway Greenway system, and then the Confluence Park is the northern end of that.
And we've had, over the years we've done the show, a number of people. We've had people from the Harahan Bridge on. We've had the Shelby, and it's interesting to watch. I mean, I've been in Memphis almost 20 years. We were talking before the show, almost 30 now, I guess. And there was a time when Memphis was the fattest city. It was the most inactive city. It was all these things, but now there's all these different pieces coming together, which is very interesting. And the coordination of that, the green print, I think Wolf River was a supporter of the what's called the green print plan.
And we were a co-author of it.
And a co-author, okay, there we go. So, and we have a map of it, which shows some sense, and it's hard to see, but I kind of wanted to look at the map in part, not so because of the detail, but the scale.
Yes.
From Hernando, Mississippi, to across the bridge into Arkansas, and certainly the Arkansas people don't think of the trail ending there. They think of it as beginning there and going all over the levees. Right. When this kind of thing, you've worked in a lot of other communities, is there kind of a virtuous circle that happens, and is Memphis at some point in that virtuous circle?
There is, and this is a fabulous community, and I've learned a lot since coming here. I've been coming here for a year, and I'm amazed at the amount of energy in this community and how everyone is sort of tugging in the same direction. And there are these intersections of time and space where you get these great thoughts about urban life, urban development, and ways in which you can make everybody's lives a little better. And that's what I see happening from the Clean Memphis activities to the farm to table operation to what the Conservancy is doing, Harahan Bridge. There's just a lot of really good convergence going on in this arena.
And let's talk a little bit about the transformation of Wolf River Conservancy. You talked before, I mean, it was founded originally to protect, the watershed and the Conservancy for a while. And I don't mean this in a negative way, but there were people who said, well, it's kind of a canoeing club. I mean, it was more of it was not an activist group so much as it was getting, helping people get on the river. And I think you still do a whole bunch of that.
We do.
But there's been a transformation of I can't think of a better word than this proactive, let's integrate with other things, let's get more people on the river. How did that come about, that the Conservancy as an organization said, we want to transform pretty dramatically?
Yeah, I've been with the Conservancy now 4 years, and Keith has been there about 4.5 years, and there's been a lot of changes at the Conservancy, but I think a lot of organizations sort of start out as a grassroots, that's their beginnings, and I think you evolve over time. So I think Keith's leadership at the Conservancy has made a huge difference. Keith and I bring a sort of a different skill set that the Conservancy really lacked. We were both entrepreneurs, owned our own businesses, and so sort of our approach to things is probably a lot different than sort of a grassrootsy.
Yeah. Well, I remember Keith in a different interview I had with him, because you both were involved in Blockbusters.
Right. When
people said, oh my gosh, how do you build a 36-mile road? And he had some comment to the effect of, that's nothing compared to building, 1,000 Blockbusters around. The construction is relatively simple, but the land acquisition, the coordination, the buy-in of people is where all, I assume, and the fundraising is where the real complications are.
Well, there's no doubt that the construction part is probably the easiest part, because at that point, you've got your permitting, you've got your plans done, you've selected a contractor, and you've got the money in the bank. So really building the trail is and frankly, while we're having fun doing this now, I'd much rather, instead of be sitting here, have a pair of boots on and be out in the woods with a contractor and watching asphalt get paved. And frankly, that's really what we get paid to do. But it's a necessary process to go through to get all the permits and all the planning and all the approvals, including the right-of-way.
Yeah. Bill, just a couple minutes left.
As you make those changes, how do the communities and the areas, the established areas around the Greenway change?
Well, we hope that the Greenway is successful in connecting up all these neighborhoods. And we hope that that there are things, programming and things that take place on the Greenway that we haven't even thought of yet, Bill. But we do believe that this is going to make the community as a whole more livable and more enjoyable. And Chuck and I have walked pretty much all the trail, And there are some tremendous landscapes out there that people are really going to be shocked that are right in their, literally in their backyards. So we're real excited to see it come through neighborhoods that have had an underinvestment. Right. And some of it is not areas that have been underinvested. They're just, it's floodplain land. It was the leftover land when Covington Pike was developed, and this is the leftover land, or Austin Peay. And so now all of a sudden we're going to introduce people to these landscapes that they've never dreamed about.
All right. Chuck, what's been your experience in other areas with how this affects residential areas in particular? Because both of these communities, Raleigh and Fraser, on this northern swing, were built, pretty much their origins were exclusively suburban residential.
Right. I think that what we have seen, our experience is, it raises property values. It raises standard of living, because it just creates a more desirable place. And even on the drive out here, as we drove across the Green Line, Bob was pointing out a neighborhood that really had a lot of investment come back in after the project was developed. So we see it as something that's very beneficial to those concerns.
All right. Well, thank you both for being here. Thank you, Bill, and thank you for joining us. Join us again next week. Good night.
DHG is a full-service accounting firm serving Memphis and the Mid-South region for more than 60 years, combining community involvement with the technical resources of a national firm. For more information, visit dhgllp.com.